pen up for us. What I want to talk about now is the history of documentation of the Natural History Museum collections in the early years, because I think something that's common to many of the larger museums which have been running for a long time is that there are quite a lot of early specimens which in many cases have limited information attached to them. Quite often this information did once exist and with work can be restored, but you need to understand what was known about the specimens in the first place. And the title of this talk, which I've put together with my colleague Jenni, who was responsible for quite a bit of the research, is The Soul of the Collection. And this is taken, if you look at the bottom of the slide, from a quotation from the great early director of the Natural History Museum, Richard Owen, appearing before a parliamentary commission in 1834-35 into the parlous state of the Natural History Museum's bird collections at that time. And one of the points he wanted to make was, I consider that in a national collection of natural history, a catalogue is quite essential. In fact, it is the soul of the collection. Now I'm going to structure my talk into four parts, four phases in the history of the collection. The early years, when the museum had very few staff and the information available from it is limited in the extreme. Then the really worst period of all, the early 1800s, when the state of the collections reached their absolute rock bottom. Then, following this parliamentary committee in 1835, a real beginning on proper documentation of the specimen that we held, culminating in the latter part of the 1800s with the astonishing work of the great Natural History Museum curator, Richard Bowdler-Sharp, in producing comprehensive documentation of the collection. Now, this specimen here is one of just 5 known survivors from the founding collections of the Natural History Museum back in 1853. The founding collections were the massive collections of Sir Hans Sloane, which formed the basis for the British Museum collections. Of course, the Natural History Museum is an offshoot of the British Museum, and Sir Hans Sloane's collections were much wider than natural history. Most of these, unfortunately, decayed many years ago. Back in the early 1900s, Richard Bowdler-Sharp was lamenting the decay of the specimens even then. And as far as we know, just 5 survive, these robust hornbill skulls. Now, in the first phase, what were the key events that happened? 1753, the founding. And at that point, there wasn't even anything written down about the material coming in, other than Sir Hans Sloane's own catalogues. By 1758, the museum was at least recording the names of donors of material in a book, but no more. Daniel Solander, who was an important early curator of natural history, began to produce some record slips, but there was very little done on birds. And as soon as 1770, poor maintenance of the collections was already leading to loss of specimens. And the strange thing was the museum somehow found some money to purchase new material, but not to look after what it already had. And when it did purchase specimens, for most of its early years, the museum had this irritating policy. If it was given specimens, it would record the names of the donors in gratitude. But if it bought specimens, by paying out money, that meant the donor needed no acknowledgement and was not recorded, which is very frustrating. The first actual documentation of the contents of the Natural History Museum was at the end of the 1800s. There had been some manuals for the attendance to the public museum produced earlier, which don't survive. But in 1805, the first edition of the Synopsis of the Contents of the British Museum was produced. This was a work for the general public. It was not meant to be a scientific work, but it does contain some useful information. For example,
This is one of the most iconic specimens in the Natural History Museum. It's the type of the California condor. And it's recorded in the early Book of Presents produced by the trustees of the Natural History Museum. It was denoted in 1796. It came from Archibald Menzies' voyage, the Vancouver voyage to the west coast of America. But it wasn't mentioned in any other documentation of the Natural History Museum until it was first mentioned in the 10th edition of the Synopses in 1816. But it had been on display all this time. And it was not noted as actually given by Menzies until the 27th edition in 1832. And for the great majority of specimens which were not this iconic and which might not ever have been mentioned in these early synopses, the information of who gave it and so forth might well fall away from the specimen and be lost. So to summarize this early period, the emphasis of the museum was to acquire and display novelties. There was little or no interest in the associated specimen data. And the best you could hope for in terms of locality information was something like North America. Information on donors was recorded largely in order to encourage further donations. And often in the Book of Presents, at least, there was no mention of the individual specimens, just a batch of so many specimens was received from such and such a donor. The lack of staff and money and the rigors of the fact that everything was going on display meant that much material was lost, but not recorded. Some funding was made available for replacements, but where purchase was involved, the museum felt no obligation to record the source of the specimens, and the only catalogues were these general public information ones. So moving on through this period, the first curators who really focused on birds were Shaw, followed by Leach. And apparently George Shaw, who was in charge of zoology from 1807 to 1813, completed a catalogue of birds. But if this is true, no trace of it survives. There is mention of it in the minutes of the Natural History Museum, but there is no trace of the document itself. And the first catalogue that we are actually aware of was Leach's 1816 systematic catalogue of the indigenous birds in the British Museum. This was an interesting production. Here is a couple of pages from it. It was produced in a form which appeared to be intended to be cut up and used for labelling purposes. And indeed, it assumed an almost mythical aura about it, because as far as we know, only one intact sample of this publication survived. And in 1882, Salvin produced a reprint of it. But he only produced a reprint of it in order to demonstrate the worthlessness of the tract and dispel the aura that had surrounded it. In fact, it does contain some quite interesting information on early collections and is certainly not worthless, perhaps just not very informative. Then in 1818, the first proper attempt at cataloguing the collection began, when Leach began his old catalogue of birds, which was continued on a desultory basis until about 1826. Leach himself had to retire shortly after he started it because of ill health. It's an incomplete and frustrating document, but it does have some innovations that were important. This is a page that shows the entry, the lower part of the page, for the California condor. And you notice it's in a sort of standardized fashion, and it has columns for associated data, who the donor was, and the approximate area of origin of the specimen. So it's the start of some systematic attempt at cataloguing. But the old catalogue never included more than quite a small proportion of the specimen material already in the Natural History Museum collection. Now, in 1828 to 1839, the museum at last began to actually publish each year a list of all the new presentations that it has received. And although these annual lists of donations and bequests are not very well known, they also do contain useful information that is not found elsewhere. Here is a page from one of the documents, and you'll see on the right-hand side of the screen here that often a list of the different species presented by a particular donor is given. At other times, it may just say, so-and-so presented 53 birds or something, which is less helpful. But again, it's scraps of information which you can bring together and hopefully reassociate with specimens that are still present in the Natural History Museum. And finally, in 1830, the first curator in the Natural History Museum who was solely responsible for birds was appointed. This was G.R. Gray. And in 1834, he began the systematically arranged vellum catalogues, which was the first serious attempt of lasting value to document the collections of the Natural History Museum. And here is a page from it relating to the ivory-billed woodpecker. Each of the pages, the species, the entries for the species were on the front and the reverse of a page when necessary. This was deliberately structured so that the leaves were loose, and if the classification system employed changed, the leaves could be rebound in a new order to reflect the new classification system. They didn't all have to be rewritten. It includes a lot on synonymy and a little bit on who donated specimens. And quite a lot of our early specimens, they have never been registered in the modern system of registration in the Natural History Museum, modern being after 1837. They're still called by their vellum catalogue numbers, that is their unique identifier. And here, you will see here, we're on page 170 of volume 23. And on the labels, you will see 170, specimen A on page 170. So here at last we have a linkage between the labeling of the specimens and a catalogue of the specimens. Although I should hasten to add, at the time this specimen would have been mounted, it would have had been on a display base or socle, and the information would have been on that. This label actually dates from much later, it's from the late 1800s. But nevertheless, at last, a catalogue was being linked to data associated with a specimen. However, it's not always that easy. Here's the California condor type that I showed you earlier, and you'll see a number on that, 10.5A. That has nothing to do with the vellum catalogues, and baffled me for over 20 years in the museum until I finally worked out what the key to it was relatively recently, and I'll come back to that later. So to summarise this period, more and more specimens are being acquired, but there's no dedicated bird curator till 1830. Curation focused importantly on identifying this material coming in, and much less usefully in rearranging all the displays according to the latest classification system in vogue. All specimens coming in are still intended for display, and all the risks that entails, except for increasing numbers of poorly maintained specimens that were stuffed into a category called duplicates and ran the risk of being destroyed. Lots of specimens decayed and were destroyed. Entering BM mythology and Shaw's and Leach's cremations of specimens, but there was little recording of this. But importantly, the museum began the process of trying to produce some type of systematic cataloguing of the specimens. This cataloguing was best exemplified by the vellum catalogues produced by George Gray, which had certain innovations, which I've listed here, which helped it. But in the review, the parliamentary review, which took place in 1834-35, it was actually written that under Dr. Shaw, the zoological collections reached their nadir. So, a new phase, the parliamentary committee, concerned, because the public is concerned, about the really poor state of documentation of material in the British Museum, particularly natural history material. And the committee report recommended that every new accession, new specimen coming into the BM, be immediately registered in a special book and then recorded in systematically arranged catalogues. And J.E. Gray, the brother of G.R. Gray, opened the first zoology accessions register, with each specimen getting a unique number. This was in 1837. And it's important here just to flag up the difference between a register and a catalogue. A register is a chronological listing of specimen material as it comes in. Often the specimen won't have been properly identified, so it may not have a complete scientific name attached to it, but everything is registered and is labelled with a label that has that registration number on it. By contrast, a catalogue is a systematic arrangement of specimens after they've been properly named, identified. It's useful for communicating information on museum holdings, but the big problem is it's usually running years and years behind the actual acquisition of the specimens, and it's far inferior for keeping track of them. Here is the register, the idea of a new register. This is one from a page from 1843. You see most of the material here is only identified to the generic level, but everything has a number, beginning 1843, 1, 13, 194, and running on. And this number is recorded on, at least in theory, on the specimen's label, although there was still a problem because most of the material was still being mounted. Later on, this is a page from a register in 1876, the registration was much more detailed right at the start. Things were become easier to identify, and more information was given in the register. But the principle has remained the same, and indeed it's remained the same ever since. We may now do it on computers, but what we do is exactly the same as this. And here is a specimen, happens to be a rather iconic one. It's a bobolink collected by Charles Darwin on the Galapagos Islands in the 1830s. It's got his original label at the bottom, just a number, which links to his notebook. It's got the label at the top, C. Darwin, January the 4th, 1837, which records the date he handed it over to the Zoological Museum. When the Zoological Museum broke up, this specimen went off with John Gould, who eventually left it to us in 1881. And you'll see it has a BM label in the middle with its registration number, 81512394, precisely identifying it. It's an interesting specimen because it retains all its labels. Most of Darwin's specimens have lost at least his original label. So in 1843, the manuscript vellum catalogues, they set up this system of registering, which was really important, but cataloguing was still considered absolutely vital, producing lists of the holdings of the museum. In 1843, the manuscript vellum catalogues were discontinued because preparations were being made for a set of published catalogues. And in 1844, G.R. Gray published the first part, covering birds of prey, of a planned multi-part systematic catalogue of the museum's world bird holdings. The big problem with this, here is an example from the very first one produced, again showing the entry for the California condor. The information in this is invaluable. It has two problems, these catalogues. First of all, they take a long time to produce. And in fact, these early catalogues, they never produced a complete set of the catalogues. There were always parts of the collections that had never been covered. But moreover, on top of that, they very unfortunately did not include the registration numbers of the new specimens in these catalogues. So trying to cross-refer between the registers and the published catalogues becomes more of an art than a science sometimes and causes us considerable problems in tracking specimens. So to summarise this period, an accessions register was an absolutely vital innovation. The production of published specimen catalogues was a good idea in concept, but the rate of production was slow and they were never completed. And those that were completed rapidly, of course, became out of date. A big problem was the published catalogues omitted the register numbers. This greatly complicates locating specimens. An increasing rate of new specimen acquisition resulted in older, faded and data-poor ones being taken off display and consigned to duplicates, where they might easily be given away or lost without recording. Finally, following publication of the World Hand List of Birds, G.R. Gray decided that his Hand List of Birds, which he produced in 1869 to 1871, was the last word in bird nomenclature and classification. And therefore he was now justified in removing all the original labels from the birds and replacing them with new labels that reflected his catalogue. Fortunately, as Bowdler Sharp subsequently recorded, only one box of birds had been thus treated by Gray when his death took place in 1872, and the collection was saved. Never take a label off a specimen. Now, to reveal the problems caused by old specimens being given away as duplicates during this period, an interesting bit of research that my colleague Douglas and I have been involved with over a few years was he visited the Nottingham Museum of Natural History back in 2004, looking at the collections, and made a note of various specimens in the Nottingham Museum that had originated in the Natural History Museum. And included was these two specimens of California quail, which when he came back and showed me the data, I immediately recognized were the long lost type specimens collected by Menzies of the California quail. He collected them on the same voyage as he collected the California condor. They had been originally documented in our collection, they're in our vellum catalogues, but they'd vanished without trace, without recording. This is because we had subsequently acquired more specimens of the California quail with better data. These had been consigned to duplicates, and it turns out they had been given away to Nottingham Museum without it ever being recorded. Nottingham Museum had no idea of their significance, and they sat there for about 135 years before we made this discovery. This was the sort of problems that arose. They are now back with us on long-term loan and assuming their rightful place in our types collection. At this point, the systematic recording of and importance of bird types wasn't really recognised in the Natural History Museum. That only came later with Sharp's great catalogue. So, to go forward now into phase 4, the last phase. This is really the key to a complete rejuvenation of the Natural History Museum collections, was the appointment of Richard Bowdler Sharp as the bird curator in 1872. He took over quite a modest bird collection of only about 35,000 specimens. And by the time of his death in 1909, he had transformed it completely. It had increased by an order of magnitude in size, up to perhaps 350, 400,000 specimens, and its state of documentation was as near to perfection as was possible at that time. In 1874, just let me move on. Here's a picture of Richard Bowdler Sharp, and it can't be emphasized too strongly what a pivotal figure he is in the history of Natural History Museum bird collections. 1874, Sharp began the first of what would be, and eventually, 27 volumes of a new catalogue of the birds in the British Museum. And importantly about this work, it included every described species, whether or not the Natural History Museum had specimens of it. It included full synonymies. It included recognition of type specimens and clear collector details. It is probably still the set of volumes that I use most often in my everyday work. It is an absolute cornerstone of documentation in the Natural History Museum. Here's the front page from the first volume. And here's a typical page, again, I think the California condor I've chosen, showing the nature of the documentation, detailed description, full synonymy, and the specimens held at the time. Almost perfect work, almost perfect, because unfortunately it still did not include the registration numbers of the specimens. And it was in thinking about this 27-volume catalogue in relation to this specimen label that I suddenly worked out what the meaning of this number 10.5.A is. If you go back to the page, the Enops californianus, which is how Sharp classified the California condor in this work, is the 10th genus in the book. It is the 5th species in that genus, And Menzies' specimen is specimen A in that in the group of specimens held by the Natural History Museum. So 10.5a is actually yet a new way of cross-linking a specimen label to the new catalogue being produced. You list the number of the genus in the volume, you list the number of the species in the genus, and A, B, C, D for the specimens that are held by the Natural History Museum. This is specimen A. May seem obvious in retrospect, but we really didn't know that until quite recently. So in 1880, the specimens were moved from the old British Museum in Bloomsbury to the new British Museum of Natural History, commonly called the Natural History Museum in South Kensington. And the opportunity, very importantly, was taken at this time to make a clear separation between the small display collections from now on and the large research collections. Gray had first advocated this in 1864, but it took the move of sight to make it come about. In the course of doing this, many former display specimens were dismounted and relabeled, and that in itself posed some problems, but it was a very important event. In 1898, the catalogue of birds in the British Museum was completed under Sharp's supervision. 27 volumes had been produced in less than 25 years, cataloguing the entire bird contents of the British Museum, set in the context of everything that was then known about birds in the world. And finally, shortly before he died, Sharp produced his monumental 400-page history of the bird collection, which is still a critical reference on the individuals who donated material during the 1800s. So to summarize this period, at Sharp's death, the bird collection was unrivaled in the world for size, for scope, and depth of documentation. It contained over 400,000 specimens in a complete published catalogue, later described as unquestionably the most important work on systematic ornithology that had ever been published. Thanks to Sharp, the collection now had its soul that Owen had referred to, and it's one that's still constantly referred to over 100 years later. Despite its scope, the catalogue had this unfortunate failing of not including registration numbers. The care with which Sharp looked after the collection, the degree to which he published on it, and the huge esteem in which he personally was held, meant that ornithologists worldwide donated material in large quantities to the collection. And it was during this time that the Natural History Museum bird collection became preeminent, largely because Sharp was there and people knew that if they donated material to the Natural History Museum, it would be looked after properly and it would be documented properly. Although a large-scale program of disposal of duplicates continued, thanks to the increased knowledge produced by the research for the catalogue of birds, much greater care over what was disposed of occurred. And finally, Sharp's huge 1906 history provides an unrivaled source of information on the collectors who donated specimens to the collection during the 1800s. Sharp made the Natural History Museum bird collection what it is, and all of us who have followed on after him have reason for huge gratitude to what he did. Thank you.